All right, thank you for everyone for joining us today on our webinar. I'm admitting everyone as they're joining. Again, this is Jamie Rogers from NASCA. NASCA is the National Association of State Chief Administrators, and we're kicking off a webinar today about reimagining today's government workforce. Admit. So NASCA, as I mentioned, is the State Chief Administrators. I know we've got a couple of people in local governments and county governments on the call today. These are typically the government officials that oversee fleet, facilities, procurement. Often about 70% of the states, they oversee HR. So that cabinet level official that sees operations of government. And so NASCA, our primary members of State Chief Administrators, decided that they wanted to advance our research agenda. And so we partnered with Accenture and NeoGov, who are going to help talk about our research today and explore a little bit further in this project. So, sorry about that. As I said, I'm Deputy the Director. My role is to really see our research and our policy. NASCA has really taken a more aggressive and robust research project. We'll have Bill Kilmartin, the Finance and Administration Lead for Accenture, to talk about our project, and Bob Oglesby, the former Chief Administrator of Tennessee. Now he's the Strategic Advisor at NeoGov. Both were great partners that helped us do a national survey, as well as a really HR experts that helped us do this. And so these slides take just a second to advance. So one thing I want to really encourage you to do while we're on this call, we'll have plenty of time to ask questions at the end, but there is a chat box feature on Zoom. And so let us know, we asked this in the preview, and we have a couple of states that have really good examples of how they're reimagining state government workforce, but let us know what your state is doing really well. So as we get to recruitment or streamlining the search, or performance improvement, or performance evaluations, if you think your state is doing this really well, write that in that chat box. And I'll call you at the end to kind of let us know what your states are doing. Really what NASCA is about is sharing state to state or state to local government research. What was really surprising and alarming, I know that we'll talk about what was surprising and alarming from our standpoint, but also we want to talk about what's surprising and alarming to our members. And then just generally, what questions do you have? So feel free to write in that chat box. After we've gone through the presentation, we will go to those questions. So before I kick it off to our two research partners, I just generally want to tell you how we did this research project. We surveyed 33 chief administrative officers, and as I mentioned, several of these HR directors, the chief HR directors in their state, reported up to the chief administrative officers, and where they did not, we worked with NASB, the National Association of State Personnel Executives, to interview the highest official HR director or the HR director that could help answer the vision of HR for state government in their states. We also worked with our partner to analyze 14 million job applications and 260,000 hires in state government. And then we surveyed both the private sector and public sector job seekers. So this is a really interesting survey for those looking for jobs in both the public sector and the private sector. What were they looking for? And so before we get into this, one of our kind of overarching themes is competing for talent has long been a challenge for state government. For those on the call, we know we're not telling you anything new. And state governments recognize it's a pretty big obstacle, but what we found is states are not doing enough to overcome them. So this research with NASCA, Accenture, and NeoGov really underscores that we really wanted to make it known that it is critical to really focus on revamping and reimagining HR. So with that, I'm going to turn off my video screen, and I'm going to hand it over to Accenture, who's helped partner this research. Sorry, I'm going to first hand it over to Bob with NeoGov to talk about this research.
Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, this is Bob Oglesby, working with NeoGov. We appreciate the opportunity to be here today and part of this great team. It was great working with NASCA and Accenture on this research project. So for those of you in the audience, we will be taking you through our study's findings today, and hopefully those of you attending will leave with some good takeaways. This slide anchors a lot of what we're talking about today. So let's take some time to go through that. I want to get you oriented first. On the left axis, we have percentages, both positive and negative. And on the horizontal axis, the study's time period, which is 2013 to 2018. Looking at just NeoGov state accounts data of the 14 million job postings and the 260,000 hires during this period that Jamie previously referenced, we've seen a 30% increase in job postings during this 5-year period. What does that mean? So for every 100 job postings states had in 2013, they had 130 postings in 2018. Now we think that's a very significant, yes, even alarming increase in the number of jobs posted at the state level, especially since the size of state government's overall workforce continues to be fairly consistent. So we believe there are a couple of things that are driving that increase. First and foremost, given we are experiencing a very hot economy with low unemployment, and thus a lot of competition for hiring talent, states are seeing a lot of their workforce leave for the private sector. Next. But additionally, the public sector is on track to have 36% of its workforce over the age of 55 by the year 2020. That's a 35% increase since the year 2000, when only about 27% of its workforce was over 55. And I think you all would probably agree that makes sense, given most of you have found that that age group hasn't been retiring as much as was previously projected during the last few years. But we all know it's going to happen. It's inevitable. It's just being delayed right now, and so we've got to be aware of that as well. So this suggests that most of that 30% increase is still due primarily to losing employees to the private sector. When you do actually, again, see more of the public sector's aging workforce start to retire, it's only going to worsen or increase that gap. So keep that in mind. Okay, next. So when you see that kind of increase in the job postings, you would hope to see the same number of increase in applications. But unfortunately, we found a 19% decrease during that same period. Example again would be for every 100 applications states received in 2013, in 2018 you're only receiving 81. Clearly this reduced supply is problematic when you have an even greater increase in demand. Bill?
Hey, thanks, Bob. Yeah, so this is Bill from Accenture. Jamie introduced me earlier, and like NeoGov and Jamie at NASCA, we're delighted to be part of the partnership in doing this research. So continuing on some of the baseline fact finding, one of the questions we asked, you see this on the slide, is the states, what do they think were their greatest workforce challenges? And you see at the top, 42% report that attracting and recruiting new employees was their top challenge. And then if you look down to the bottom, you see that turnover was a challenge, but not the top challenge. Another point I would make here before we advance, it's our impression from talking to states across the nation that competing and winning the war for talent is an issue that is relatively well understood across the country. As a matter of fact, we hear this conversation in what I call the C-suite, the executive legislative leaders of state and local governments, governors, mayors, chief human resource officers, chief information officers, the list goes on and on. That everybody's talking about, how's the government going to compete and win the war for talent? So I think it's an issue that people recognize is a top priority. Jamie, let's go on to the next slide. Still in the domain of the fact finding, the traditional value proposition you see represented on the left part of the slide could be summarized in these 3 points where job seekers would say, I come to the public sector for a secure long-term employment. I come for the benefits. I come for the pensions. Those are the attributes of the traditional value proposition. But you see some of the data there on the right-hand side. Those value propositions are not as effective nowadays as perhaps have been the case when I joined state government way back in 1977. So, what it does is it begs the question, can the government create a new value proposition as it competes in the war for talent? Let's go to the next slide. And Bob, I think this is going back to you.
Thank you, Bill. Here we have the survey results from NeoGov's most recent job seeker report. This is documenting what the marketplace is saying are the main value propositions driving people to the public sector versus the private sector. Again, as Jamie described, we surveyed over 3,000 job seekers in both the public and private sectors, asking them what do they find attractive about working in these two sectors. No surprise, on the left in the box you see public sector job seekers are motivated by job security, benefits, meaningful work, and serving one community. Again, these are the main value propositions driving people to the public sector. Next. And then looking in the next box on the right, you see those working in the private sector are motivated by competitive salary, career advancement, and working in an innovative sector. Looking not only at the factors, but also the percentages associated with each factor for both sectors, there's a fairly clear picture presented here of what motivates those working in the public versus the private sector. Okay. However, as Bill described in his last slide, there's the eroding value proposition of the public sector's health care benefits and pension plans. And additionally, job security of working in the public sector is not as strong as motivator as it once was. Okay. Next. So from 2008 to 2018, we've seen a reduction in employees working in state government. That drop of 162,000 employees is over a 5% reduction. Even though we saw a little pickup in employment the last 5 years after the Great Recession, a net 5% reduction is a fairly significant drop in the size of the sector workforce over the last 10 years. Again, we think much of that's occurred as a result of employees leaving the public sector positions for the private sector, but also from attrition after others have retired and from a proactive reduction in force to reduce costs. So candidates are no longer seeing the public sector offer the security of long-term employment or the benefits like they once did. Next. As previously mentioned, the private sector is seeing a significant increase in hiring. This chart is from the National Association of State Retirement Administrators, and it shows that state and local hiring has been relatively flat the last 11 years, at least in comparison to the private sector, which has been experiencing a significant level of growth at 12% from 2007 to 2018. This is, of course, really putting a real pressure on the public sector, both its current employees and its ability to hire new employees. Jamie?
Oh yeah, so other compounding factors that we've looked at when we interviewed state chief administrators was it remains for public sector the inability to pay competitive salaries. That wasn't as surprising, but one of the number two is really surprising to us, that there's a negative perception around working in the public, working for the government was the number two. When we talk to HR directors around the country, this is kind of coming up about this negative perception around working in the government. Another one that when we've got quite a few questions as we've been talking about this research since March is the other question states keep coming back was, well, what about it being in a less attractive city, far away from a very populated urban center? And you can see, on average, that's not a high barrier, but for about 30% of the states, probably those states where the state capital is not in an attractive city, it still is a barrier. So I wanted to point out two kind of big things that we got questions here, that negative perception around government and a growing negative perception around government, as well as some of the other changes that are currently happening. Lifetime employment is becoming less appealing. As Bob talked about earlier, traditionally state government was seen as this very long-time secure place to have a job. And with some of the workers, that's less appealing, is that lifetime employment. We've already talked about the lack of public support, and we've already talked about the inability to compete in compensation. And as well as, every time I've done this, we always get some questions about union considerations. I'm a highly unionized state. How does that make me different? And I will note, just in terms of the research, when we cross-tabbed the difference between unions and non-unions on these solutions, on answers, we found very little difference except for one question, which is the job description question. We'll talk a little bit about that there, where union states answered it a little bit different. But since we always got that question, I wanted to point that out. And then with that,
It's back to me. Yeah.
Back to you.
When it comes to the public sector's difficulty in attracting and retaining talent, we see the most pressure coming from government trying to employ the millennials. They are now the largest cohort of today's workforce. Pew Research says 35% of today's U.S. workforce are millennials, or about 45 million of the U.S.'s total 130 million workers. So while there's over 40 million millennials working in the private sector, they represent 39% of its 110 million employees today. So 40 million, the 110. And there are only about 4 million millennials working in the public sector, representing about 19% of its 20 million employees. There's not a lot of good data out there to break this down further, except for we did find that millennials are 17% of the federal government's workforce. I heard Bill say, and I looked it up too, I think I found online that best guess is that millennials represent about 14% of state government's workforce. So it's clear millennials are not finding the public sector as attractive as they are the private sector. And this is even more concerning as the number of millennials in the workforce will continue to grow. They're expected to be 50% of the total workforce in just 2 years and 75% of the workforce by 2025. So why aren't millennials a bigger part of the public sector workforce? You've heard Bill talk about it, you've heard Jamie just talk about it as well. There's lots of articles online you can find as well. So remember the points we talked about earlier. The public sector is eroding value proposition, the private sector's attraction because of compensation, also being more innovative, location, a perception of working for the government. We believe those are all factors that are impacting the smaller percentage of millennials in the public sector's workforce. But we also believe that the public sector's aging workforce may be a factor as well. As older people are traditionally more set in their ways, they're less likely to be innovative and embrace change or even invest in new technologies. All these are factors that are important to millennials, and you can see they'll find those more easily in the private sector versus the public sector. Okay. So when you combine both the increase in supply of public sector jobs with the decrease in demand measured in the number of applications, we have a 49% gap today. And if this isn't getting your attention, it probably should. We're certainly seeing less quantity applicants and less qualified applicants. And ultimately what's going to happen as a result of that is, if it isn't already, it's a diminishing quantity and quality level of citizen service. Okay. Next. For those viewers that are with local governments today, this slide shows the change in job postings versus applicants just in local governments. Your gap has now grown to 28%. Increase in job openings has increased about 30% from 21 to 27% just since 2015, but seems to be leveling off some now. But we have seen a much larger change in the number of applicants this past year, dropping to below the 2013 application level. So although less than the state gap, the 28% gap for local governments is still a big gap, and we believe you too can only expect this to get worse. Next. Along those lines, it's interesting that this survey's results say that in 2018, the public sector job seekers are most interested in working in state government. Not a whole lot more than working in local government, but just ahead. We don't know if this is a trend yet or not, but seeing this triggered my memory of seeing data from just a few years ago that had said just the opposite, that job seekers preferred to work in local governments. So maybe we are experiencing some type of swing here. It was just seconds. There you go. This seems to be supported by data we just saw showing applications for local governments are dropping, while the number of applications for state government has flattened out since 2015. Clearly something to watch if you're in local government. Okay. Anyway, back to the state government's talent gap issue. This is a question that NeoGov gets quite a lot when we talk about this data. So how does this gap play out in various state government jobs? That's what this slide is trying to address for you. It's showing, let's take some time to understand this. It's showing the change in the number of applicants per posting in these various job categories over the last 5 years, again, 2013 to 2018. There was only one job category, the one on the far right in yellow, that was above the line or seeing a positive number or increase in number of applicants per job posting during this time period, and that was for IT professionals. All the other positions had negative gaps or decreases in the number of applicants per posting during this 5-year period. So back to the IT professionals. This means if you were getting 100 applications for every posting in 2013, in 2018, on average, you were getting 8% more, or 108 applications. Whereas correctional workers over there on the left side at minus 49%, where they're showing that decrease between 2013 and 18. Again, if you were getting 100 applications for one of those jobs in 2013 and 2018, you were getting 49% less, or on average only 51 applications per job. Altogether, the change in total number of applications per job is down 38%. Okay. So here's another way to look at that change in number of applicants per state job. Overall, from 2013 to 2018, we have seen the total number of applicants per total job drop by 38%. In other words, where our state customers were seeing an average of 71 applications per posting in 2013, in 2018, their number of applicants dropped to an average of 44. I understand we get this question too, just to kind of hit it off. This data doesn't mean there was or was not enough candidates in the applicant pool to make an offer, although the probability certainly is greater that the smaller the pool, the less likely is you'll find a quality candidate. Okay, Jamie?
All right, thank you. So we've outlined why it was already critical, why it's becoming even more critical, and why this should really be raised attention. So since we represent the cabinet level officials, they really asked the National Association to make a case to take back to governors, to take back to chief of staff on why HR is becoming even more critical on the pipeline. And then not only that, how do you solve the issue and how do we come up with recommendations? So our board adopted 7 recommendations moving forward on how to really focus in on HR issues. I want to say that these are not all of the issues, but these are the ones that our board really focused in. So we're going to bucket these in 2 areas. First, on reshape recruiting. As you saw, there was the #1 thought was how do we get new employees into government? So we have quite a few recommendations on recruiting. And the other bucket is once they are an employee, how do we retain that employee? How do we keep that employee? How do we grow that employee? Or how do we progress that employee? So that's the second big bucket of our recommendations. And so I want to echo again that these are our recommendations of state members, and what makes this so interesting is these are peers saying here's a group of recommendations. Okay, and with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Bill.
Well, thanks, Jamie. Having rolled around in the data and sort of admiring the nature of the problem, would then turn to what would be the strategies that state governments might consider when looking at solutions. So on this slide, what we're doing is looking at the data about initiatives to measure the degree to which governments are already underway launching certain initiatives, and there's 4 of them that we did in the survey. So let's take a look at them. So going over to the far left, you'll see that 6 and 33 is 39% of the governments are proactively doing something about their marketing approach to recruiting. And we'll come back and we'll talk about that point in more depth later on. So 39% is good, but it could be better is the sense of it. Going to the next set of stacked bars, asking about the degree to which governments have streamlined and improved the hiring process. And 33 plus 9 is 42% have taken proactive efforts in that regard, which is good. But again, 42% is good. 100% would be fabulous. Next question. Have people have initiatives underway to improve the attractiveness of employment by improving the work environment itself? A variety of different ways to do that, which again we'll touch upon later in this deck. Only 15% of initiatives in that area. So again, it sort of asks, begs the question, what more could be done? And then to the far right, the degree to which states are already updating and modernizing their job descriptions and their roles and their job classifications, really the foundation of talent management. Only 18% are to a very large extent or to a large extent. Again, headroom for further improvement. Let's go to the next slide, Jamie. So here we're going to look at the particular issue of job definitions, job descriptions. You may think of this in terms of position classification with the associated, compensation. And so the question we're asking is, it was really couched in terms of, as in this period of dynamic disruptive change, the degree to which you have changed the fundamental job descriptions and job classifications. And state chief administrators report 3+18 is 21% are already underway in some degree of changing those. In contrast, the private sector, 4+38 is 42%. So the data tells us that the private sector has the perception that modernizing the job descriptions is important, and that the government sector perhaps does not yet reach that conclusion. I think that's an interesting thought to keep in mind when we get to the larger issue of how does the public sector recruit the next generation of public servants and compete successfully in the war for talent. Bob, why don't you give us a few more statistics on this, and I'm going to hand it over to Bob on the next slide. Bob, you're up.
Sorry, there I am. So in referencing one of Bill's previous slides indicates that states have not updated or modernized their job descriptions as much as they could. So when you're writing your job descriptions going forward, we're recommending that you include the top motivators of public sector job seekers by job category. This chart on the left-hand side in the dark blue-gray boxes lists those job motivators we previously discussed that are interesting to the public sector job seekers: job security, benefits, meaningful work, and serving one's community. And then across the top in the orange box, we were able to categorize much of the public sector survey respondent data into these 9 job categories. So we're suggesting to best attract job seekers in any of these job categories, you need to be looking at the motivators job seekers are saying are most important to them. Okay, Jamie? Next. What NeoGov is seeing in a lot of this across the country is that most postings are agency focused, meaning they are written from the perspective of the employer and not necessarily in a way that's attracting its candidates. So what we suggest you do is write job descriptions that are more job seeker focused. So instead of just posting your job openings, you advertise your positions in a way that are attracted to job seekers. If you do that, you should find greater success. Okay? So back to the chart I was just showing you a second ago. For law enforcement, in the first column on the left, you see it says 73% related to job security. You should be writing about job security in your job advertisements. And then over there for maintenance workers, about 6 columns from the left, 4 from the right, you see them listed, and you see what's more important to them is benefits and less about meaningful work. Okay? So here's an example of how you can do that. You've got here on the left an example of a posting for a nurse practitioner position in a Department of Mental Health that was previously posted on an agency's website. Under the job responsibilities, it starts off saying, the Department of Mental Health is a drug-free workplace. All candidates will be required to pass a mandatory pre-employment drug test. And then under job purpose, under clinical supervision of the medical director. Okay, I think you're getting the point. So they're saying they think that the best way to attract the market's best job seekers, they should lead off their job posting by telling them they must pass a mandatory drug test and they'll be watched by a clinical supervisor at all times. Point is, I'm just not certain that information is the best way to lead, even if it is accurate. It's not providing the best promotional opportunity for an employer trying to actually attract, much less hire, a top candidate. So here on the right now, here's an example of how the job description might be rewritten from a job seeker perspective. Want to do meaningful work that has a real impact on your community? Please come join the very tenured nurses at the Department of Mental Health. Our mission is to service those who aren't being served, which not only benefits the community greatly, but also delivers a great benefit package to you. It's a win-win. Our nurses' average tenure is over 10 years. We'd be honored to have you on our team. You also see under supervision, we include under supervision and describe what the new employee will do, but in a way that's more attractive to them. So again, you need to be promoting your positions in a way that will attract job seekers. Okay. When you think about being attractive job seekers, you also need to focus on those opportunities for success when you can offer them. While job security and benefits are still strong, keep in mind they have lessened and don't hold quite the appeal they once did. While meaningful work in serving one's community are still strong factors and worth emphasizing. Competitive salary and being an innovative sector, not strengths of the public sector, and it's easy to assume the private sector will most likely continue to maintain its edge. But we also believe the public sector can improve its value proposition by increasing its focus on career advancement. Given career advancement has been identified as the second most important goal, you see coming in the private sector at 41% versus competitive salary at 50. We think that this is a great opportunity for the public sector. And given that the public sector will be experiencing more of its workforce retiring in the upcoming years, you're creating opportunities for others to advance their careers. So again, we think this is a great opportunity for public sector to shine, and in so doing, increase its attraction by job seekers. So please start an aggressive conversation about career development, career advancement in your organizations. Okay. So I think we jumped too fast. Let's back up a little bit. Go back to the right there. So here's an example of how you incorporate career advancement into your job postings. At the very bottom here, we added on to our recommendation before. It says, whether you're joining the team for 3 years or 20, you'll have an opportunity to grow your career. So I know some of you probably don't like to hear that we're recommending a statement about joining our team for 3 years or 20. But I also suggest you just acknowledge, accept, again, that's the new norm for the workforce today, and will continue to be that way with millennials. So don't pass over opportunities to fill slots with qualified candidates, even if they're only going to stay a few years. Okay? So again, just when you modernize your job descriptions, as Bill was talking about, keep in mind you need to be writing them from the perspective of the job seeker and not the employer. Incorporating the highest priority motivators for that position instead of writing it from the perspective of the employer, which limits your value proposition, and the job seeker is just thinking of nothing more than just a basic employment. Bill, you want to take it?
Yeah, thanks. Well, so let's now turn our attention to a slightly different, strategy of a solution, and here we're probing on the topics of professional development and training. And you can see the data there and the questions that we asked. And one of the things that's interesting is that the public sector emphasizes professional development and training more highly than the private sector. You see that top bar, 31% versus 17%. And this is a strength area. So one of our recommendations is emphasize the professional development and the training. It's a differentiating and distinctive factor in competing against the private sector for new employees. And it also, of course, is extremely important in maintaining and retaining the current workforce. So, that would be a strategy that we believe merits investment, is promoting an ongoing program of professional development and training. And I want to also mention that the full report, you're seeing here an extract. The full report is many excellent case studies from the states of initiatives that are currently underway. And there's several excellent examples that go along with each one of these strategies that we're talking about in the deck. So I'd commend for your consideration. Read the full report. I'm sure that Amy would send you a link, and you'll see all those case studies, so you can find out like who's doing well in an area of, say, professional development, who's doing well in an area of job descriptions, and so forth and so forth. Excellent examples. And I guess the point is, while a lot of great stuff is out there, more work is merited. Let's go to the next slide. This is again more data. In this particular slide, what we're looking at is the concept of enhancing and promoting your brand. And you see the two elements of the data that have the gray. So the opportunity to do meaningful work. The public sector, 51%, the commercial sector, 36%, an area of strength in which governments can differentiate put a finer point on that, when we also look at the motivating factors for new employees, we find that and you ask them what are the top 5 things that attracts a candidate to a new job. The opportunity to do meaningful work is usually in the number 1 and number 2 position. It's extremely important to the job seeker, and that is especially true with the millennial generation. So it's an area of strength, and therefore a strategy that we think could work to government's benefit, generally speaking, and very specifically for the millennial generation. You turn your attention to the second grade bar, back one there, Jamie, the opportunity to attain life-work balance, another area of strength, and another area that usually ranks in the top 1 or 2 motivating factors for job seekers is the work-life balance. And again, scores very, very highly. The data tells us is very, very important to that younger generation of employees that governments will need to be recruiting. Now let's go to the next slide. So this is just some further data and some thoughts on some topics about how to differentiate and position state government in a manner that is competitive and attractive and indeed compelling in the ongoing battle for talent. So you see the data there about emphasize the meaningful contributions. This just reinforces the point that we had previously made. You see in the middle, supporting flexible work arrangements to get to this notion of work-life balance, again, reinforcing the previous point. And then over on the right-hand side, highlight the interesting and varied work. And Bob talked about this, the ability to have a career ladder. In governments, you could move from agency to agency and program to program much more adeptly than would be the case in commercial environments. And again, an attractive feature in the value proposition for the workforce of the future. Let's go on to the next slide. Talking about work-life balance, one of the questions that we queried in the research was to the extent to which government is offering alternative or flexible work environments. And you'll see that the answer is yes. The government is doing a lot of this, which is great because it's one of the things that the job seekers value, and it's one of the things that the government is already doing a fair amount of. So another area of strength that could be considered as part of your strategy is continuing to emphasize flexible work arrangements, and there's a variety of different ones. You see the data there in terms of what people are currently doing, and we have reasons to believe that more of this is likely to continue. Let's go over now to some more of the recommendations, and Jamie, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. So we hit on recruiting, and now, as I mentioned, the other big bucket was around the employee experience. So how do you retain employees, or how do you keep an employee? Bob talked a little bit about moving from maybe 3 years to 5 years if it's those millennial employees. And so we're going to switch over to this employee experience bucket in our recommendations there. And so we'll kick off streamlining the search, which has long been an issue in government in the time to hire, and I'll send it over to Bob.
Thanks, Jamie. As Bill mentioned just a few minutes ago, our survey results indicate that many states are streamlining their hiring process, at least to some extent. And they're doing this because they don't want to see their top candidates drop out of their hiring cycle before they can be hired. So our research data from the survey confirms that as well, saying that their time to hire over the last 10 years has improved by 28%, reducing on average from 101 days in 2008 to just 73 days in 2018. Okay, this slide illustrates that same actual time to hire data, but quartiling, if you will, or grouping into 4 chunks of equal size, ranked from best to worst. So for instance, the top 25% of the state customers are completing their hiring cycle, and that's from posting to hire, not from vacating the position, but from posting to hire in 36 days. The next quartile is seeing an average of 46 days, and so on. So especially those of you with time to hire that falls into the 3rd or 4th quartile, you definitely should be asking yourself and your teams, how can you speed up your process to not lose quality candidates going to work somewhere else because of your longer cycle times. So our survey also asked those 3,000 job seekers, where are you looking to find job opportunities? This chart shows you the best opportunity for reaching the job seekers online. Job boards are clearly the #1 source, not clearly, they are ahead of your state government online portals at 62%. And so we suggest you need to be on job boards, clearly. But we're also hearing many of you have been using social media, and that's fine, but recognize that social media sites are only being used 25% of the time by job seekers. We also hear a lot about job fairs, and you'll see there clearly aren't a big thing to job seekers right now, coming in at only 8%. Again, your best opportunities today are online, not offline. Okay. So we dove a little deeper in the survey as well by asking the job seekers, where are they online? And they said, again, in job boards, they're like Indeed and government jobs, USA jobs, and they're doing, those are higher percentages of the time over social media sites like LinkedIn and Facebook. We had this further broken down that shows where everybody is, but these are the top ones we wanted to share with you today. So given the public sector is already experiencing a 49% gap between the job postings and applications, and we expect this gap to continue to grow larger, we suggest you need to be more strategic in promoting your jobs, and you do that by increasing your reach, by casting a wider net. Bill?
Well, thanks, Bob. So just now focusing on a slightly different vector in terms of looking at strategies and solutions. The point here in this data is about the influence of automation. And draw your attention to the data on the right-hand side. When the private sector was asked the question, the degree to which they're using new digitized tools to enhance and energize, power their talent management strategies, 92% being very proactive in that regard versus 21% on the state government side. So what we're talking about is automated applications like NeoGov or other, human resource information systems, robotic process automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, putting together some of these technologies with chatbots and various other virtual assistants. This is an area, could be a component of the strategy that merits additional attention for the government to really catch up. In the interest of time, let's move on. This is some more data on the particular topic of artificial intelligence. Bob, I'm going to ask you to comment on this a bit, and then I'll come back and make another comment myself.
Okay, thank you, Bill. When job seekers, little feedback here. We okay now? When job seekers say they want meaningful work, keep in mind what they're saying is they want to have their work provide significance and purpose to make a positive contribution to the greater good. Basically, they want to be spending their time being productive on things that matter and truly make a difference. Augmenting human resources with automation, as Bill mentions, is key. Just think about it. Who goes into a career to fill out paperwork? How much more meaningful would any public servant, whether a social worker, health professional, you name it, find their daily work if they were spending more of their time actually addressing citizens' problems? Case in point, when I was Tennessee's chief administrator, my department helped the Department of Human Services automate their processes. And after we were done, someone asked them, so how did you increase your processing time so drastically? And their response, no kidding, was because the process improvement and automation, fewer of their employees were calling in sick and actually returned to work. And so now that they were fully staffed, they're able to do because they were doing the work they wanted to do, they were able to improve their processing time. So it really is, you need to be looking very hard at every opportunity to automate as a way to attract and retain your talent. And as Bill also mentioned, as an HR example, through use of artificial intelligence, and NeoGov was able to help their customers find qualified diversity candidates much quicker than any person or team or persons could ever hope to do. Bill? Yeah,
there's an appendix to this deck that does a deep dive on the particular topic of using artificial intelligence. One caveat to folks as well, let me say it this way. We're all very bullish on using artificial intelligence. For example, a common use case is to filter the resumes and to therefore concentrate on the ones that are most likely to demonstrate the characteristics of successful recruitment and a successful employee. And that's done through artificial intelligence, which is an algorithm. And the algorithm is created and developed by a human being. So the point here is the ethical side of artificial intelligence. If the human being who's developing the algorithm has an unconscious bias, it's entirely likely that that unconscious bias could be factored into the algorithm, which the machine will then faithfully execute. So if the human being has a bias of a gender or ethnic or other nature, it all comes back to the human being. The artificial intelligence will faithfully execute what the human does. This is a significant point. We can do a whole webinar on just that topic itself. Let's move on to the next one, job performance. Okay. We want to turn to the notion of job performance, and what the chief administrators are telling us is they want to turn performance evaluation and job performance into a proactive, positive element of the employee experience, which, by the way, dovetails with, I mentioned the top 5, motivating factors. Continuous feedback is on that list. And so there seems to be a lot of interest in, looking at this part of the talent management strategy and thinking about ways to make it a proactive, positive differentiator. I believe several of the states are doing interesting work in this regard. Michigan is one of them. And Jamie, do we want to ask Michigan to comment on this?
Yeah, I am. Sorry for that. Look, I'm looking at Michigan is on the line, and I don't know, Bram, if you are there and want to talk about some of the work you've done on job evaluations. We're running a little short on time, so we can always push this to the end. Kind of looking to see if he's
cover this. This is
yeah.
We went out. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. One of the things we did in our agency is we went out and talked to all of our employees at annual town halls, et cetera. One of the things that we heard from a lot of people pretty shockingly is that, some of them don't even do one-on-one meetings with their supervisor. They don't ever have the opportunity to even talk one-on-one with their supervisor. And we found that as a big kind of demotivator for these employees. Not having that direct connection, not being able to bounce ideas, not being able to come up with solutions. And so, we took kind of a blunt approach to this, kind of a lead a horse to water approach, but, we just actually made it required that all employees have performance evaluations. We have certain quality things that we require. You require objectives that are, smart, that are measurable, and, time box, et cetera. We also have required that that supervisors do quarterly meetings with their employees to talk about those performance evaluation. And so we, this is something that, especially for new supervisors, can sometimes be kind of daunting. So we've given them toolkits with scripts, and here are some of the things that that you can talk about and that kind of thing. And then we also require that they talk about individual development plans. So you're having that conversation with each employee to say, here's where you are now. Where do you want to be at the end of the year? How can I help you get there? But as we go out and talk to our employees, one of the messages that we stress to them is that this is, there's dual accountability here. I can create the space so that your supervisor will sit down with you, but you need to really take ownership of your career, and you need to figure out what you want and figure out where your value is to that. So, that's kind of the basic thing that we've done, and we've just really seen a big difference with employees, always making sure that they have that open line of communication, that they have meaningful conversations, that they have objective measures, so they know, how they can be successful in their jobs.
Thanks, Bram. That's fabulous. I'll cover off on the next slide really quickly. Jamie, you want to advance us?
Yep.
So the point here is succession planning. Government should do more of it. I'm just going to pause there. Oregon, I know, has figured out some ways to navigate around union, civil service, other aspects that make succession planning in the public sector a challenge, but not impossible. So I'd like to call upon the folks in Oregon, see if they want to offer a comment here.
And I'm not sure if Oregon's on the line, let me know on the chat box. But with that, I'll hand it over to you. Bill, I don't see them.
Okay, Jamie, so why don't we just move on? So we want to leave, I know you want a few minutes here for other comments and questions, so back to you for the closing.
Yeah, well, I want to thank both. If you have any comments on the chat box, make sure to let me know what your state's doing really well. A couple of you wrote in what you're really proud about, and we may have a few minutes to ask you a little bit more about that. Or what was surprising? And so for those of you who weren't at the introduction, I do want to emphasize the reason NASCA started doing this research is we were being asked by our state members about more benchmarking reports. I'm being asked by my governor, by my chief of staff, by my other colleagues where I stand in terms of other states. So that's why we did this national survey. So now you'll have more data to say 40% of states are doing telework, 30% of states are not doing succession planning. And that was our goal with part of this report, to come out with some of those benchmarking to be a tool for states. But what of this is surprising, and what do you need to focus on? Or if there's any other questions you have. So we did have a couple in the chat box, and I think you touched on this a little bit, Bob. I think you'd be the best person to answer this. But how do you know when you get your total number of applicants versus the total number of qualified applicants, the difference? So if you could talk a little bit about, you guys do the health indicators on when you have too few or too many, and how you can know if they're qualified or not.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. What we do is we take the start data of each of our customers, and we can do that by position and posting, and we can assess how long has historically taken you to fill a position. So let's say typically you need 50 candidates to fill an IT position. So we can tell if you hope to post that for only a certain amount of time, if you're not getting to that level in that amount of time, we can say you're going to need to boost your position posting by going to other job boards and things like that to get the number of candidates you need. So your quantity of your pool size is large enough, and therefore you'll find the candidate based on your historic performance.
And then do you have any suggestions working for state agencies on developing their job descriptions for job postings? So I know Bill's done a lot of work on the job descriptions, or Bob as well. So how should they even start with developing their job descriptions for the job postings?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that, because I'm sort of passionate about the government's, I would say it this way, having worked for the government myself for 25 years, I worry about recruiting the next generation of practitioners. And it really does start with a modern, a relevant, attractive job description. And I'm seeing now a lot of states are trying to redo their position classification compensation schemes to make them more relevant in today's terms, in terms of the job duties, the functions, the competencies, as well as the market relevant compensation associated to these job families. So to me, it's an area that of focus, and it's sort of like we build the foundation and then build the house on top of it.
Great. And then the next one, and I'm happy to take a stab on this basis, anecdotal, but I'll see if either of you guys have an answer. What factors are forming the negative perception around working for government? So what's changed in the last couple of years that are making government this negative place to work? And while you guys are thinking on some answers, I know anecdotally some of the stuff that we heard when we were doing qualitative surveys on this, it's interesting that it feels like when public sector is running, there's kind of been a war on public sector. When a governor or legislators are running, they haven't highlighted the public sector as a great place to work, especially with some of the, when you talk about some of the teachers or union salaries that have been really highlighted on a national spectrum on the pay of government. And so that's some of the stuff that we heard just nationally. There's some negative perception around working for state governments, around some of the strikes for state government. And I don't know if there's anything that our speakers have to add about what's causing the negative perception around government, about working for government.
I've spent quite a bit of time looking at this myself, trying to decide what I want to do with my career after I left state government, and not to get into that whole area, but I think it has a lot to do with lack of trust. You've seen the lack of trust for decades now decline, primarily around the federal government. I'll have to say that's where most of the data is, at least. But I think it comes down to lack of transparency, and certainly government is complex. And a lot of times the citizens just don't understand how and why decisions are made. So, what I've been focusing on is thinking that data is going to be key to helping people really have objective reasons for making their decisions and justifications for their business cases and why they do what they do. So I kind of gave you an answer as to what I think is one of the key components of how we combat that going forward.
Now I'm just going to offer my personal opinion on this matter. As a young man, many of the leaders that I admired told me that public service was a noble profession, which I believed to be true then, and I continue to believe to be true today. And I wish there'd be more of that, where our leaders were just talking in the various outlets about the noble profession of public service.
And I think we're seeing a couple governors, the governing recently did, where they looked at all the governing state of the state speeches, and it was in quite a few of the state of the state speeches about kind of reframing public sector work, and so talking about pay raises or talking about putting trust into the public sector. So we did see it on a couple of governors' agendas. So we're close to time. We have about 2 minutes. I'm going to pull up the contact information here. We are happy to share the slides. I know Sarah posted that. We will. For those who are not familiar with NASCA, majority of these slides are currently on the NASCA's research page, so we have a shorter version of this slide deck. This webinar is also recorded, so we'll put this recording on the NASCA resource page, which is up and available to the public. So you'll go to NASCA, you'll go to our resource page, and it'll be in there. And with that, I really want to thank Bill Kilmartin. They really brought a lot to the table, and they had done a very similar survey with the private sector. And so a lot of these data points, we were able to compare private sector data to public sector data, which is stuff we're often asked about. As well as Bob actually started on this project as a state chief administrator and is now in the corporate sector. But it's really great to have a former state chief administrator working on this project. And so I don't know if there's any last minute thoughts from both of our partners before we log off.
I just thank you again. It's been great working with both NASCA and Accenture. There's clearly a lot more that needs to be talked about regarding workforce and keeping the public sector in business, if you will, going forward with these workforce issues. So hopefully there'll be more discussion around this topic going forward.
Yeah, interesting and important conversation. Let's keep the conversation going.
It's a great school.
Yep, well, and that's what our goal is. We kind of, through this report, we learned that HR was a top priority, and you learn what questions you want to ask next and what recommendations we want to tackle. So this will remain on the NASCA agenda, and we'll continue to do more work. If anyone is interested, a couple states wrote that they're doing some really interesting work on alternative work, on survey satisfaction, on changes to benefits, paternity leave, family leave, foster leave. We would love to highlight you in a future webinar. So if you're on the call and want to talk about that, I think what people really like to hear is what are other states doing and how can we implement that. So feel free to send me an email, and we'd love to have another webinar hearing what you all are doing. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us. You can go to nasca.org. On our research page, you'll find this research. You'll also find a shorter version of the slide deck, and shortly we will have the recorded version on our resources page. So thank you so much, Bill. Thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you.